Love has no understanding of age, and the heart rarely listens to reason. When 12-year-old Elyra saved Alpha King Tharic's life on a bloody battlefield, she didn't know she was also saving her own future. The king, grateful but wise, looked at this gifted child and made the hardest choice of his reign. He sent her away. "You deserve more than the life of a shadow behind a king," he told her gently. "I'm too old, and your story's just beginning." For 10 long years, Elyra carried those words like a promise. She grew strong, learned to lead, and discovered the true power of her rare gift. Now she has returned, not as the child who once saved him, but as a woman ready to stand beside him as an equal. But will she find the king she remembered, or has time changed them both too much? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Castle Valdris, its golden light catching the worn edges of an ancient crown that sat heavily upon King Tharic's greying head. At 45, he carried the weight of 2 decades of rule in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he moved through halls that had once echoed with his confident stride. The crown of Valdris, carved from blackened oak and inlaid with silver wolves, had begun to feel more like a burden than a symbol of power. Tharic paused at the great window overlooking his kingdom, watching the morning mist rise from the forest beyond the castle walls. Somewhere in that vast expanse of pine and oak lived thousands of his people, wolf-shifters who looked to him for protection, guidance, and the wisdom that supposedly came with age. The irony wasn't lost on him that wisdom often felt more like accumulated regret. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of Marcus, his chief advisor and closest friend for nearly 15 years. The older man approached with the morning reports, his weathered face bearing the same concern it had carried for months. "The border scouts have returned with troubling news." Tharic didn't turn from the window. In the courtyard below, young wolves were training, their movements sharp and eager. Once he had moved with that same certainty, that belief that strength alone could solve any problem. "Tell me!" 3 more villages report strangers in the night. Not our people, not any pack we recognize. They leave no scent, no tracks, but livestock goes missing, and the villagers speak of shadows that move wrong. Marcus set the reports on the king's desk. "Lord Garrett thinks we should increase patrols. Lady Morwen suggests we reach out to the neighboring territories." The weight of the crown seemed to increase with each word. Tharic finally turned, noting how Marcus's hair had gone completely silver in recent years, how the lines around his eyes had deepened. They were all getting older, all carrying burdens that seemed heavier with each passing season. "And what do you think, old friend?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the king with eyes that had seen too many battles, too many difficult decisions. "I think you look tired, Tharic. More tired than a king should look when his people need him most." The informal address spoke to their long friendship, but it also highlighted something that had been growing clearer each day. Tharic was no longer the unstoppable force he had once been. The injuries from countless battles had accumulated. His reflexes, while still sharp, lacked the lightning speed of his youth. Most telling of all, the loneliness that had always been part of ruling now felt like a constant ache in his chest. "Do you ever wonder?" Tharic asked, moving to pour himself tea from the service that appeared each morning. "What it would be like to have someone truly share this burden. Not just advisors offering counsel, but someone who could stand beside you and carry half the weight." Marcus's expression shifted, taking on the careful neutrality he wore when the king ventured into personal territory. "You speak of taking a queen, I speak of partnership." Tharic settled into his chair, noting how even that simple movement brought a twinge from his left shoulder, where a blade had found its mark 3 years prior. "The kind where 2 people complement each other's strengths instead of one simply supporting the other. Such partnerships are rare, Your Majesty, especially for those who rule." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the courtyard below. Through the window, they could see a group of young nobles engaged in heated discussion, their voices carrying up to the royal chambers. Lord Garrett's son was among them, his face red with frustration as he gestured emphatically. "What are they arguing about now?" Tharic asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Succession, most likely," Marcus replied diplomatically. "There's been talk." Of course there had been talk. Tharic had no heir, no wife, no clear line of succession. At 45, he was still young enough to father children, but old enough that the court had begun to worry. The ambitious families circled like vultures, each hoping their daughter might catch the king's eye, each plotting how their bloodline might ascend to the throne. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of them realized. Tharic's heart had been touched only once, 10 years ago, by a child whose wisdom and courage had saved his life. But children grew up, became their own people, chose their own paths. He had no right to hope that the remarkable girl he remembered would return as a woman who might see him as anything more than a king who had once needed rescuing. "The border situation," he said, forcing his thoughts back to immediate concerns. "Send word to the pack leaders. I want a full council meeting by week's end. If these strangers represent a genuine threat, we need to know what we're facing, and if they're merely scouts for something larger." Tharic stood, feeling every one of his 45 years. "Then we prepare for war, as we always have, alone if necessary." Marcus gathered the reports, but hesitated at the door. "Your Majesty, if I may, being alone isn't the same as being strong. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing when to accept help." After his advisor left, Tharic remained at the window, watching the young wolves train. Their instructor was calling out corrections, pushing them to be faster, stronger, more decisive. It reminded him of his own training decades ago, when the world had seemed full of clear choices and righteous causes. Now everything felt complicated, layered with consequence and doubt. He ruled a people who deserved better than a tired king, nursing old wounds and older regrets. They deserved a leader who could protect them from whatever shadows moved in the night, who could build alliances and inspire loyalty through strength rather than mere tradition. The healing stone he kept in his private chambers, a small, blue-green gem that had saved his life, seemed to pulse with remembered warmth whenever his thoughts turned to its giver. Elyra had been 12 years old, wise beyond her years, gifted with abilities that could have made her indispensable to any ruler. Instead, he had sent her away, told her she deserved better than a life in his shadow. He had meant it as kindness. Now facing threats he wasn't sure he could handle alone, he wondered if it had been the greatest mistake of his reign. Not because he needed her power, though that would certainly help, but because the loneliness of leadership had become a weight he wasn't sure he could carry much longer. The crown of Valdris sat on its stand, waiting for him to resume the burden of another day's decisions. Outside, his people looked to the castle for guidance and protection. And somewhere, perhaps, a grown woman who had once been a remarkable child was living the life she had chosen, free from the shadows of kings and the weight of crowns she had never asked to bear. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face bearing the kind of urgency that made palace guards straighten their spines. Tharic was already awake, standing on his private balcony with a cup of tea that had long since grown cold, when Marcus burst through the chamber doors with uncharacteristic haste. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, slightly breathless from hurrying up the tower stairs. "A messenger has arrived from the Eastern Territories. He bears the seal of—" Marcus paused, his weathered face showing an expression Tharic had never seen before, confusion mixed with something that might have been hope. "He bears the seal of Lady Elyra of Thornwick." The teacup slipped from Tharic's fingers, shattering on the stone balcony with a sound that seemed to echo far too loudly in the morning stillness. Elyra. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a rush of memories he had carefully locked away for 10 long years. A child with eyes too old for her face, hands that glowed with healing light, a voice that had spoken with the wisdom of ages when she told him he would survive his wounds. "Elyra," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his lips after so many years of silence. "You remember her?" Then, Marcus's voice was carefully neutral, but Tharic caught the underlying current of concern. The child who saved your life at the Battle of Thornwick Pass. How could he forget? The memory was burned into his mind with crystalline clarity. The pain of the blade that had found the gap in his armor. The spreading darkness as his life bled out onto the battlefield. And then suddenly, impossibly, warmth and light, and the face of a 12-year-old girl whose hands had pulled him back from death's threshold. "She's no longer a child," Tharic said quietly, his mind struggling to process the implications. She would be 22 now, indeed, and according to the messenger, she has become quite the leader in her own right. Lady Elyra of Thornwick, they call her. She's united 3 smaller packs under her guidance, established trade routes with the southern kingdoms, and by all accounts, has become a formidable diplomat and strategist. The words should have filled Tharic with pride. The remarkable child had become a remarkable woman, just as he had hoped she would. Instead, he felt a complicated mix of emotions he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Pride, yes, but also something deeper, more dangerous. Something that felt suspiciously like longing. "What does she want?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. Marcus held out a rolled parchment tied with a deep green ribbon. The seal bore the image of a thorn bush in bloom, a symbol Tharic remembered from ancient texts representing growth through adversity. She requests an audience. The message is brief, but her tone suggests urgency. Tharic took the scroll with hands that were steadier than he felt. The parchment was of high quality, the handwriting elegant but strong. He could see hints of the careful letters a 12-year-old had once formed when she wrote him a simple thank-you note before leaving his court. "Your Majesty, I hope this letter finds you well and your kingdom prosperous. I write to request a formal audience at your earliest convenience. Recent events in the Eastern Territories have brought to light information that concerns the security of both our lands. I believe our mutual interests would be best served by direct discussion. I remain, as always, your grateful and humble servant, Lady Elyra of Thornwick." The formal language couldn't hide the intelligence behind it, nor the subtle hint that whatever brought her back to Valdris was serious enough to warrant personal attention. But it was the closing that made Tharic's chest tighten. "As always, your grateful and humble servant." Did she really still see herself that way? As someone who owed him gratitude rather than the other way around. "She saved my life," he said, more to himself than to Marcus. "I sent her away to protect her from this court, from the burden of being seen as the king's favorite. And now she returns, speaking of service and gratitude. Perhaps," Marcus said carefully, "she returns because she chooses to, not because she feels she owes you anything." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. A 12-year-old child might feel obligated by gratitude or duty, but a grown woman, a leader in her own right, would come only if she wanted to be here. The question was, what did she want? The timing, Tharic mused, moving to his desk to study the border reports that had been troubling him for weeks. These mysterious strangers, the increasing instability, and now Elyra returns claiming she has information about threats to both our territories. "You think the timing is more than coincidental?" "I think," Tharic said slowly, "that the little girl who could see into a man's heart and know exactly what he needed to hear has grown into a woman who understands much more about the world than I've given her credit for." The implications were staggering. If Elyra had information about the threats facing his kingdom, if she had spent 10 years building alliances and gathering intelligence in the Eastern Territories, then her return might be exactly what Valdris needed. But it also meant facing the woman that remarkable child had become, dealing with whatever feelings he had spent 10 years trying to bury. "What are your orders, Your Majesty?" Tharic looked at the scroll again, noting the confident flourish of her signature, the quality of the paper and seal that spoke of prosperity and established authority. This was not a petition from a former subject seeking favor, but correspondence between equals. "Send word that Lady Elyra of Thornwick is welcome at court and will be received with all appropriate honors." Prepare the azure suite for her arrival. She should be housed as befits her station as an allied leader, not as a returning subject. Marcus nodded, but Tharic caught the slight smile that tugged at his advisor's lips. "And when shall I tell her to expect this audience?" "As soon as she can arrive. If the situation is as urgent as her letter suggests, we cannot afford delay." Tharic moved to the window, looking out over his kingdom with new eyes. Somewhere out there, perhaps only days away, the child who had saved his life was traveling toward him as a grown woman with her own power, her own agenda, her own reasons for returning. "Marcus," he said, not turning from the window, "what do you know about the current political situation in Thornwick?" "Lady Elyra has earned a reputation for fairness and wisdom. The pacts under her guidance have prospered, and she's managed to maintain peace with territories that have been feuding for generations. Some say she has a gift for seeing the heart of any conflict and finding solutions that serve everyone's interests. Of course she did. The child who had looked at a dying king and known exactly what he needed, not just healing, but hope, had grown into a woman who could bring peace to ancient enemies. The question that kept circling in Tharic's mind was whether she would see him as just another conflict to be resolved, or if there might be something more personal in her decision to return. The next few days would bring answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask for 10 long years. As he stood in his tower, looking out over the kingdom he had ruled alone for 2 decades, King Tharic found himself both dreading and anticipating the arrival of the woman who had once saved his life with nothing more than courage, compassion, and a 12-year-old's unshakable belief that some people were worth saving. She arrived 3 days later, and everything about her entrance spoke of deliberate choice rather than chance. Tharic watched from the great hall's upper gallery as the gates of Castle Valdris opened to admit a small but impressive entourage. At its head rode a woman whose bearing immediately commanded attention, not through ostentation or demanding ceremony, but through the quiet confidence that surrounded her like an invisible crown. Lady Elyra of Thornwick had indeed grown into everything the remarkable child had promised to become. Even from a distance, Tharic could see the elegant line of her shoulders, the way she sat her horse as if she had been born to command, the careful attention her small retinue paid to her every gesture. She wore traveling clothes of deep green and brown, practical, well-made, but clearly marking her as someone of importance. At her side, she carried a staff carved from ancient oak, its surface polished smooth by years of handling. This was her leadership staff, Tharic realized, the symbol of her authority over the pacts she had united. The sight of it sent a strange mixture of pride and something deeper through his chest. The child he had sent away to find her own path had not just survived, she had thrived, built something lasting, become a leader worthy of respect. As her party approached the great steps, Tharic found himself studying her face, searching for traces of the 12-year-old who had once knelt beside his broken body on a battlefield. The bone structure was the same, the determined set of her chin unmistakable, but everything else spoke of 10 years of growth, challenge, and hard-won wisdom. Her hair, once wild and tangled from a child's adventures, now fell in neat waves to her shoulders, practical but elegant. Her clothes, while travel-worn, showed the quality that came with prosperity and position. Most striking were her eyes, still the same deep green that had seemed to see straight through to his soul, but now holding depths that spoke of experiences he could only imagine. They were the eyes of someone who had made difficult decisions, carried real responsibility, earned the right to be heard. "Your Majesty," Marcus murmured from beside him. "She's requesting an immediate private audience. Her message indicates the matter cannot wait for formal ceremonies." Of course she would cut straight to the heart of whatever had brought her here. The child who had ignored protocol to save a dying king had become a woman who understood when urgency trumped ceremony. Grant her request. The small council chamber in an hour, time enough for her to refresh herself, but not long enough for court gossip to spread. As Elyra dismounted in the courtyard below, Tharic caught a glimpse of the grace that had replaced a child's quick movements. Everything about her spoke of controlled power, of someone who had learned to command, not through force, but through competence and earned trust. When she looked up at the castle, her gaze found the upper gallery where he stood, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. The recognition was instant and mutual. 10 years collapsed into nothing as those familiar green eyes met his, carrying with them the weight of shared memory and unspoken questions. She inclined her head in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and equal, the acknowledgement of one ruler to another, not a subject's deference to her king. Then the moment passed, and she was turning to speak with the castle's steward. Her attention focused on the practical matters of arrival. But that brief connection had been enough to confirm what Tharic had both hoped and feared. This was not a child returning to the protection of her king, but a woman coming to meet with an equal. An hour later, Tharic waited in the small council chamber, an intimate room, lined with books and warmed by a fire that took the chill from the stone walls. He had chosen this space deliberately, somewhere that spoke of conversation rather than royal audience, of consultation between equals rather than a subject petitioning her king. When the door opened, he rose from his chair, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The years had been kind to her, he noted. She had the bearing of someone comfortable with authority, the kind of quiet confidence that came from having earned respect rather than inherited it. Her traveling clothes had been replaced by a simple but elegant dress of deep blue, and she had left her leadership staff in her chambers, coming to him as simply as possible. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a curtsy that was respectful but not subservient. "Lady Elyra." He gestured to the chair across from his. "Please sit." "It's been far too long." She settled into the chair with the kind of grace that spoke of years spent in diplomatic settings, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Up close, he could see more clearly how the child had become the woman. The determined chin was the same, the intelligent eyes unchanged, but there was a new quality to her presence, a weight of experience that made her seem older than her 22 years. "You look well, Your Majesty. The years have been kind to you." The polite words carried an undertone of genuine concern, as if she were assessing not just his appearance, but his well-being. It reminded him vividly of the child who had looked at his wounds and known exactly what needed healing, not just his body, but his spirit, as have they to you, clearly. "I've heard remarkable things about your work in the Eastern Territories. 3 packs united under your guidance, trade agreements with the southern kingdoms, and peace maintained where there has been conflict for generations." A slight flush colored her cheeks. "I've been fortunate in my advisors and blessed with circumstances that allowed for cooperation rather than conquest." The modest words couldn't hide the pride in her voice, and Tharic found himself smiling. "I suspect there was more skill than luck involved. The reports I've received suggest you have a gift for finding common ground where others see only conflict, perhaps. Or perhaps I simply learned from watching how a wise king chose mercy over vengeance when he had every right to demand payment for services rendered." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond their surface meaning. She was referencing his decision to send her away rather than keep her close, to choose what was best for her over what might have been easiest for him. "You never owed me payment," he said quietly. "If anything, the debt was mine." Was? The question was gentle but pointed. "Is," he corrected, meeting her eyes. "Will always be. You gave me back my life, Elyra. Everything I've accomplished since that day exists because of your courage and compassion." She was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the same intensity she had shown as a child. "And yet you sent me away. I sent you to find your own path, to become the remarkable leader you clearly have become, free from the obligations and expectations that would have surrounded you here. And if I had wanted to choose those obligations?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He had wondered, over the years, if she had resented his decision, if she had wanted to stay. To hear her confirm it, to know that he might have denied her something she had actually wanted. "You were 12 years old," he said finally. "A child shouldn't have to choose between her own future and a king's gratitude. And now, I'm no longer 12, Your Majesty. I'm a grown woman, capable of making my own choices about where I belong and whom I serve." The words carried implications that made his heart race and his mind recoil in equal measure. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? That she had returned, not just on political business, but because she had chosen to return to him. "What are you asking of me, Elyra?" Her green eyes held his steadily, and in them he could see traces of both the determined child and the diplomatic leader she had become. "I'm asking you to consider that some debts transcend simple gratitude, and some choices are worth making twice." Before Tharic could fully process the implications of her words, she reached into her traveling pouch and withdrew a rolled parchment sealed with unfamiliar wax. "But first, there are more immediate concerns that require your attention." The shift from personal to political was so smoothly executed that Tharic found himself admiring her diplomatic skills, even as he struggled with disappointment at the change of subject. She had learned not just to lead, but to control the pace and direction of crucial conversations, a skill any ruler would envy. "The threats you've been experiencing along your borders," she continued, unrolling what appeared to be a detailed map, "are connected to a larger movement that has been building in the Eastern Territories for over 2 years. Tharic leaned forward, forcing his attention to focus on the immediate danger rather than the personal undercurrents swirling between them. The map she spread before him was unlike any he had seen, detailed not just in geography, but in political allegiances, trade routes, and what appeared to be migration patterns of various pact territories. "This level of intelligence," he said, studying the careful notations, "represents months of careful observation, longer than that. When I began uniting the pacts under my guidance, I quickly learned that true leadership requires understanding not just your own territory, but the forces that might threaten it." She pointed to a series of marks along what he recognized as his eastern border. "These incursions into your lands aren't random raids or simple banditry. Then what are they?" "Testing. Someone is probing your defenses, mapping your response times, identifying weak points in your border security." Her finger traced a pattern across the map that made Tharic's blood run cold. "The attacks follow a systematic pattern, never enough to provoke full military response, but sufficient to gauge your kingdom's current strength." The implications were staggering. "You're suggesting we're facing an organized enemy with significant intelligence capabilities." "I'm stating it as fact." Elyra rolled out a second document, this one covered in detailed notes in her precise handwriting. "Over the past 18 months, I've documented similar probing actions against every major pact territory east of your kingdom. Those who showed weakness were absorbed or destroyed. Those who proved strong were avoided, temporarily." Tharic studied the documents, his mind racing through the strategic implications. If Elyra's intelligence was accurate, and the quality of her work suggested it was, then Valdris faced a threat unlike anything he had encountered in 2 decades of rule. "Who are we facing?" "That's the question I've been trying to answer." She leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since entering the chamber, she looked tired. "What I can tell you is that they're well organized, extremely patient, and possess resources that suggest backing from someone with significant power and wealth. Another kingdom? Possibly. Or a coalition of displaced pacts, or mercenaries hired by someone who wants to see the established territories weakened." She met his eyes. "What matters is that they're coming, Your Majesty. The probing phase is nearly complete. Soon they'll move to active conquest." The weight of leadership, always present, suddenly felt crushing. Tharic rose and moved to the window, looking out over his kingdom with new understanding. The people in the courtyard below, the families in the villages beyond the castle walls, the packed territories that looked to him for protection, all of it was threatened by an enemy he couldn't even identify. "Why bring this to me yourself?" he asked without turning. This intelligence could have been conveyed through diplomatic channels. He heard her rise from her chair, her footsteps soft on the stone floor as she joined him at the window. Because diplomatic channels can be compromised, and because some conversations require trust that can only be built through direct contact, and because... She was quiet for a moment, standing close enough that he could catch the faint scent of pine and wildflowers that seemed to cling to her. And because I wanted to see if the king I remembered still existed, or if he had been worn away by 20 years of ruling alone. The honesty in her voice made him turn to face her. They were standing close now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, and close enough to notice that she was studying his face with the same intensity he was bringing to hers. And what have you concluded? That he's older, more tired, carrying burdens that have left their mark. But the essential man, the one who chose mercy over vengeance, who sent away someone he cared about because he thought it was best for her, he's still there. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither seemed quite ready to address directly. Instead, Tharic forced himself to step back, to return to the safer ground of political discussion. If your assessment is correct, I'll need to mobilize defenses, reach out to allied territories, prepare for a conflict that could last months or years. Yes, but you won't have to face it alone. He looked at her sharply. What are you offering? An alliance. Formal agreement between Valdris and the Thornwick Coalition. Mutual defense, shared intelligence, coordinated response to external threats. She paused. And my personal commitment to stand with you through whatever comes. The offer was both more and less than he had hoped for. An alliance would provide crucial support in the coming conflict, but it was still a political arrangement, carefully structured and diplomatically safe. Her personal commitment, however, hinted at something deeper, something that made his pulse quicken, despite his efforts to remain professionally detached. Such an alliance would require significant negotiation. Formal agreements, approval from your pack leaders, already obtained, she smiled, the expression transforming her face and giving him a glimpse of the confident child who had once ignored protocol to save a king's life. I may have mentioned that I've learned to plan ahead. Despite the seriousness of their discussion, Tharic found himself returning her smile. Of course you have. The question is, what do you want in return? Respect, recognition as an equal partner rather than a subject seeking favor. And she hesitated for the first time since entering the chamber. The chance to discover what might have grown between us if circumstances had been different 10 years ago. The admission hung in the air between them. Brave and vulnerable and completely unexpected. Tharic felt his careful emotional control slip, replaced by a mixture of hope and terror that made him feel like a young man again. Elyra, I know the obstacles, she said quickly. I know the age difference, the political complications, the fact that you see me as someone you're responsible for protecting. But I also know that some connections transcend conventional wisdom, and some chances are worth taking. Before he could respond, a sharp knock at the chamber door interrupted them. Marcus's voice called urgently, Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The moment shattered, reality rushing back with all its complications and demands. Tharic moved to open the door, finding Marcus's face grave with concern. What is it? Border scouts report a large force moving toward our eastern frontier. They'll reach our territory within 2 days, possibly less. Tharic turned to look at Elyra, who was already rolling up her maps with efficient movements. Her face showed no surprise, only grim confirmation. It appears, she said calmly, that the testing phase has ended ahead of schedule. The war room of Castle Valdris had seen many crisis meetings over the decades, but few with the urgency that now filled its stone walls. The great table at its center was covered with maps, reports, and tactical assessments that painted a sobering picture of the kingdom's situation. Around it stood the key figures of Tharic's court, Marcus, Lord Garrett, Lady Morwyn, Captain Hayes of the Royal Guard, and now Elyra, whose presence had shifted the entire dynamic of their strategic discussions. The enemy force numbers, approximately 2,000. Captain Hayes was reporting, his weathered face grim. Mixed composition, wolf shifters, but also others we don't recognize. They move with discipline that suggests professional military leadership. Tharic studied the battle map that now dominated the table's center, marked with enemy positions, friendly forces, and the critical terrain that would determine the outcome of any engagement. After 20 years of rule, he could read such maps like others read books, seeing not just geography but possibilities, risks, and the terrible arithmetic of war. Our border garrisons total 800, Lord Garrett added, his aristocratic features showing the strain of rapid mobilization. We can call up militia from the surrounding territories, but it will take days to muster them. And their training is limited. The timing is deliberately chosen, Elyra said, her voice cutting through the tactical discussion with analytical precision. They've waited until late autumn, when travel is difficult and communication between territories is slowed by weather. By the time you can summon significant reinforcements, they'll have achieved their initial objectives. Lady Morwen, the court's most experienced diplomat, turned to study Elyra with calculating eyes. You speak with considerable authority for someone who arrived only yesterday. How can we be certain your intelligence is reliable? The question carried undertones of suspicion and territorial jealousy that Tharic recognized immediately. His court had grown comfortable with established hierarchies and relationships. Elyra's sudden arrival, bringing both critical intelligence and obvious influence with the king, threatened to upset carefully maintained balances of power. Because, Elyra replied calmly, my territory lies directly between this enemy force and your eastern border. If I'm wrong about their capabilities or intentions, my people will pay the price before yours do. That assumes you're truly allied with us, Lord Garrett interjected, his tone carrying the subtle aggression of a man whose position felt threatened. Forgive me, Lady Elyra, but your sudden appearance, perfectly timed with this crisis, raises questions about coincidence versus coordination. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Tharic felt his jaw tighten at the implicit accusation, but before he could respond, Elyra's voice cut across the tension like a blade through silk. Are you suggesting, Lord Garrett, that I orchestrated an invasion of my own territory in order to deceive King Tharic into granting me an audience I could have requested at any time over the past decade? Her tone remained level, but there was steel beneath the diplomatic courtesy. Because if so, I'd be curious to hear your theory about what I hope to gain from such an elaborate deception. Marcus stepped smoothly into the growing tension. Perhaps we should focus on immediate tactical concerns rather than questions of motivation. Lady Elyra's intelligence aligns with our own observations, and regardless of why she's here, her forces could provide crucial support. What forces? Lady Morwen asked sharply. We've seen no army accompanying Lady Elyra. Because they're already in position, Elyra replied, unrolling another map that showed the eastern territories in greater detail. I didn't bring an army to your castle, Lady Morwen. I brought intelligence and coordination. My forces have been mobilizing in response to this threat for weeks. 1,200 trained fighters positioned along the routes the enemy must take to reach your territory. Captain Hayes leaned forward, studying the positions she indicated. You're proposing a coordinated defense? Our forces and yours working in concert? I'm proposing we stop them before they reach your borders, Elyra said firmly. Fighting them in the borderlands means the damage falls on contested territory. Let them reach your villages and innocent people die. The strategic wisdom was undeniable, but Tharic could see the political complications brewing in his advisor's expressions. Accepting military coordination with Elyra meant acknowledging her as an equal partner, shifting the balance of influence within his own court. Such coordination would require unified command, Lord Garrett pointed out, his tone carefully neutral. Who would lead this joint operation? The question hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Tharic knew that his answer would define not just military strategy, but the future relationship between his kingdom and Elyra's growing power in the east. "Joint command," he said finally. "Lady Elyra and I will coordinate strategy together." Lady Morwen's eyebrows rose. "Your Majesty, with respect, such arrangements can lead to confusion in critical moments. Military command functions best with clear hierarchy. Then it's fortunate," Elyra said with a slight smile, "that King Tharic and I have experience working together under pressure." The reference to their shared history was subtle but unmistakable. 10 years ago, a child had taken command of a life-or-death situation and saved a king through decisive action and absolute trust. Now a woman was offering to stand beside that same king as an equal partner in defending both their peoples. "There's another consideration," Marcus said quietly. "If Lady Elyra's forces are already engaged with this enemy and we commit our troops to joint operations, we're essentially entering a conflict that's already begun. There may be no diplomatic solution." Tharic looked around the room at his advisors, people who had served him faithfully for years, who had every right to be concerned about sudden changes in strategy and alliance. Then he looked at Elyra, who stood calmly beside the map, waiting for his decision. The battle map showed the harsh mathematics of their situation. His forces alone would struggle against a disciplined enemy of 2,000. With Elyra's support, they had a real chance not just of victory, but of protecting the innocent people who looked to him for safety. But beyond strategy lay something more personal. The woman standing beside him represented both his past and potentially his future. 10 years ago, he had chosen to protect her by sending her away. Now she had returned, strong enough to stand beside him, offering partnership instead of protection. "We coordinate our response," he said firmly. "Lady Elyra, I'll need detailed intelligence on enemy movements and your assessment of the best positions for joint operations. Captain Hayes, begin immediate mobilization of our border forces. Marcus, send fast riders to the Pact territories. We need every available fighter, but they should rally to positions that support our coordinated strategy." As his advisors began the complex work of war preparation, Tharic found himself watching Elyra. She had moved to the detailed tactical maps, pointing out terrain features to Captain Hayes and answering his questions with the confidence of someone who had studied every mile of the contested territory. She had grown into exactly what he had hoped she would become, a leader capable of standing on equal ground with any ruler, someone who could see the large patterns and make the hard choices that leadership required. The question that remained was whether their personal connection could survive the transformation from the child he had protected to the woman who no longer needed his protection. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of coordinated preparation that would have been impossible without the shared battle plan that Elyra and Tharic developed together. Working side by side in the castle strategy room, they created something that transcended simple military coordination, a seamless integration of their different approaches to leadership and warfare that surprised even them with its effectiveness. Tharic brought 20 years of defensive strategy, intimate knowledge of his territory's strengths and vulnerabilities, and the hard-earned wisdom of a ruler who had learned that the best victories were often won before the first blow was struck. Elyra contributed detailed intelligence, innovative tactical approaches, and a fresh perspective that challenged assumptions he hadn't realized he was making. "Your border fortifications here," she said, pointing to a series of defensive positions on the eastern frontier, are positioned to stop traditional pack warfare, individual challenges, territorial disputes, raids for resources. But this enemy fights differently. Tharic leaned over the map, studying the positions he had considered unassailable for over a decade. How so? They use coordinated unit tactics, combined arms approaches that integrate different fighting styles. Your fortifications funnel attackers into killing grounds that work perfectly against individual warriors or small groups. Against disciplined formations moving in coordination, they become traps for your own forces. The observation was both tactically brilliant and personally humbling. Here was proof of how much she had grown, how her perspective could complement and improve his own strategic thinking. The child who had saved his life through intuitive courage had become a woman whose analytical mind could save his kingdom through superior planning. What do you propose? She traced new positions on the map, her finger following terrain features he knew intimately, but had never considered in quite this way. Mobile defense. Use your knowledge of the land to force them to fight on your terms, not theirs. Make them chase you through territory where your people have every advantage. As they worked through the tactical details, Tharic found himself watching her as much as listening to her strategic analysis. The child's determination had evolved into adult confidence, but something essentially, Elyra remained unchanged. The way she focused completely on whatever problem demanded her attention, the slight furrow between her brows when she was thinking through complex possibilities, the grace with which she moved from grand strategy to minute details without losing track of the larger picture. "There's something else," she said, looking up from the maps to meet his eyes. "Something I haven't told your advisors because it's not yet confirmed, but you should know." The serious tone made him straighten. "What is it?" "I believe this enemy force is testing more than just military capabilities. They're looking for something specific, information, resources, or people. The pattern of their probing attacks suggests they're searching, not just conquering. Searching for what? I don't know yet, but Tharic—" She paused, using his name. Without title, for the first time since her return, the intimacy of it sending warmth through his chest. "What if they're looking for the same thing that brought me back here?" The implications sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the castle's ancient stones. "You think they know about your abilities? About what happened 10 years ago? It's possible. The healing gift I used to save your life. It's not common, but it's not unique. There are others with similar abilities, scattered across the territories. If someone is gathering such people, either to use them or to eliminate them as potential threats." She didn't need to finish the thought. If their enemies were targeting individuals with rare gifts, then Elyra's return to his court had placed her directly in danger. The irony was bitter. 10 years ago, he had sent her away to protect her from the burdens of royal life, and now she had returned just as a different kind of threat emerged. "All the more reason to end this quickly," he said, forcing his mind back to strategic concerns. "If we can defeat this force decisively, we send a message to whoever is behind them that our territories are too costly to attack." She nodded, but he could see the worry in her green eyes. "There's something else we need to discuss. The joint command structure we announced to your advisors. It's politically necessary, but it could create problems in actual combat if we haven't worked out how to coordinate under pressure." The observation was tactically sound, but it also opened a conversation that felt far more personal than military. How did they work together as equals when their entire shared history was built on a relationship between a child who had served and a king who had been served? What do you suggest? Practice. Not just with maps and theoretical scenarios, but actual coordination. Your advisors are already suspicious of how well we work together. Let's make sure their suspicions are justified by developing real partnership. Over the next several hours, as reports came in from scouts and messengers carried orders to distant garrisons, Tharic discovered that working closely with Elyra felt both foreign and familiar. Foreign, because he had ruled alone for 2 decades, making decisions through internal deliberation and consultation with advisors who ultimately deferred to his judgment. Familiar, because something in their interaction echoed the trust that had existed between them 10 years ago, when she had taken responsibility for his life and he had trusted her completely to save it. She challenged his assumptions without undermining his authority, offered alternatives without insisting on her own preferences, and showed a talent for seeing the human implications of strategic decisions that complemented his focus on tactical effectiveness. When messengers brought word that civilian populations were fleeing the Eastern Territories, she immediately began planning refugee assistance. When supply reports indicated potential shortfalls in arrow production, she offered access to her territory's craftsmen. "You've thought of everything," he observed. As she finished outlining contingency plans for civilian evacuation, "I've learned to think like a leader responsible for real people rather than just strategic positions," she replied. "When your decisions affect families you know personally, you develop different priorities." The gentle criticism stung because it was accurate. Ruling from a castle, making decisions that affected thousands of people he would never meet, had gradually made him focus more on abstract strategic concerns than individual human costs. Elyra's approach reminded him of something he had lost over 20 years of kingship, the personal connection that made leadership feel like service rather than burden. "Is that why you came back?" he asked quietly. "To remind me what I've forgotten?" She looked up from the supply manifests she had been reviewing, her green eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "I came back because 10 years taught me that some connections are worth fighting for, and some people are worth standing beside regardless of the cost." The admission hung between them, brave and vulnerable and completely honest. Before he could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of Captain Hayes, whose expression indicated urgent news, "Your Majesty." "Lady Elyra," he said, slightly breathless from hurrying up the tower stairs. "Our forward scouts report the enemy has split their force. The main body continues toward our territory, but a smaller group, perhaps 300 fighters, has broken off and is moving toward the Thornwick settlements." Elyra was on her feet before the captain finished speaking, her face showing the kind of controlled urgency that spoke of personal stakes. "How long until they reach Thornwick?" 6 hours, perhaps less if they push hard. Tharic felt the strategic situation shift with devastating clarity. The enemy had divided their forces, creating 2 separate threats that would require 2 separate responses. But it also meant that he and Elyra would have to separate as well. She to defend her own people, he to protect his borders. "It's a trap," Elyra said, reading his thoughts with the same intuitive understanding she had shown as a child. "They're forcing us to split our attention, dividing our leadership at the critical moment." "Then we don't fall for it," Tharic replied, reaching for his sword belt with movements that felt natural for the first time in years. "We respond together as partners, your people and mine. We protect them all." As they prepared to leave Castle Valdris to coordinate the defense of both territories, Marcus appeared in the doorway of the strategy room, carrying an ancient wooden box that Tharic hadn't seen in decades. The old advisor's face bore an expression of grim resolve, mixed with something that looked suspiciously like long-held guilt. "Your Majesty," Marcus said formally, "before you depart, there's something you both need to know. Something I should have revealed years ago, but hoped would never become relevant." Tharic paused in strapping on his armor, noting the way Marcus's weathered hands trembled slightly as he set the box on the strategy table. In all their years together, he had never seen his advisor show such obvious distress. "What is it, old friend?" Marcus opened the box with careful reverence, revealing a scroll that seemed far older than anything in the castle's regular archives. The parchment was yellowed with age, its edges brittle, and the text was written in the formal script used for the most important royal documents. "This is the prophecy of the Thornwick Alliance," Marcus said quietly. "It was given to your father by a seer shortly before your birth, and he made me swear to keep it secret unless circumstances made its revelation necessary." Elyra moved closer to the table, her green eyes fixed on the ancient document with intense curiosity. "A prophecy about an alliance with Thornwick. But my territory didn't exist when Tharic was born. The Thornwick coalition was formed only recently." The prophecy doesn't refer to a territory, Marcus said, carefully unrolling the scroll. It refers to a person, someone who would carry the name Thornwick not by birth, but by choice. As the full text became visible, Tharic felt the world shift around him with the same disorienting intensity he had experienced on that battlefield 10 years ago. The words, written in the flowing script of formal prophecy, seemed to blur and refocus as their meaning penetrated his understanding. When the king's strength begins to wane and shadows gather at the borders, one shall come from Thornwick's embrace who once saved the crown from death's cold grace. Child become woman, gift become power, alliance shall bloom in the darkest hour. Two hearts that beat as one shall stand to guard the realm with joined hands, but only if the king can see that strength shared is strength set free. Elyra read the words aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. This can't be coincidence. The timing, the specific references to saving the crown, the language about shared strength. It's about us, Tharic said, the certainty hitting him like a physical blow. It was always about us, Marcus nodded heavily. I believe so. When you were wounded at the Battle of Thornwick Pass, and that child appeared with healing powers, I suspected. When she chose to name her territory after the place where she saved your life, I was more certain. Now, with enemies gathering and her return perfectly timed to provide crucial aid, you think our meeting 10 years ago was destined? Elyra asked, her analytical mind clearly struggling with the implications of predetermination versus free will. I think, Marcus said carefully, that some connections transcend simple chance, and some choices are guided by forces larger than our immediate understanding. Tharic sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the reframing of everything he thought he knew about his relationship with Elyra. The guilt he had carried for 10 years about sending away someone who might have wanted to stay, the doubt about whether their connection was real or simply based on gratitude and nostalgia, the fear that his feelings for her were inappropriate given their history. All of it took on new dimensions in light of the prophecy. The prophecy mentions that the alliance will bloom in the darkest hour, Elyra observed, her strategic mind focusing on practical implications. If this current threat is what the seer foresaw, then our enemy's timing isn't coincidental either. They're acting now because this is when we're meant to face them together. But it also says the alliance depends on whether the king can see that strength shared is strength set free. Marcus added pointedly. The prophecy suggests that the outcome isn't predetermined. It depends on choices made freely, particularly your choice, Your Majesty. The weight of implications settled over Tharic like a heavy cloak. The prophecy wasn't just about military alliance, it was about personal partnership, about his willingness to accept Elyra as a true equal, rather than someone he needed to protect or someone who served him out of gratitude. 10 years ago, he said slowly, I sent you away because I thought you deserved the freedom to choose your own path. I didn't want you bound to me by obligation or gratitude. Elyra moved to stand beside his chair, her hand coming to rest gently on his shoulder. And now? Now I'm wondering if I was so focused on protecting your right to choose that I never considered you might choose to return to me. He looked up at her, seeing not the child who had once saved him, but the remarkable woman she had become through her own efforts and choices. The prophecy says our alliance depends on my ability to see shared strength as freedom rather than burden. But what if I've been so afraid of burdening you that I've refused to see you clearly? What do you see when you look at me now? She asked, her voice carrying the same directness that had characterized their first meeting. I see a leader who chose to build something meaningful with her life. I see someone who could have stayed safely in her own territory, but chose to risk everything to help defend mine. I see a woman who has every right to expect partnership rather than protection, respect rather than gratitude. He reached up to cover her hand with his. I see someone I was foolish to let go, and even more foolish to fear welcoming back. The ancient prophecy scroll lay open before them, its words seeming to shimmer in the lamplight as if pleased to finally reveal its secrets. But even as Tharic felt the rightness of understanding settle over him, practical concerns reasserted themselves. "The prophecy speaks of our alliance blooming in the darkest hour," he said, rising to pace toward the window where Scout's signals could be seen flashing in the distance. "But it also warns that we must stand together to guard the realm. If this enemy is searching for people with gifts like yours, then they're not just threatening our territories," Elyra finished. "They're threatening the very people the prophecy says are meant to stand against them." Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "There's one more element of the prophecy that bears consideration. The phrase about 2 hearts that beat as one suggests that the alliance foretold is not merely political or military. The implication hung in the air between them, adding personal stakes to strategic necessity. Tharic had spent 10 years trying to convince himself that his feelings for Elyra were based on gratitude and nostalgia. The prophecy suggested that what he felt was both deeper and more significant than mere personal attraction. "The timing of this revelation," Elyra said thoughtfully, "suggests that understanding our connection is crucial to facing this threat successfully. But prophecies can be tricky things. They often require their subjects to act authentically rather than trying to force predetermined outcomes. Meaning we face this enemy as partners because we choose to, not because some ancient seer said we should. The prophecy provides context, but our choices give it meaning." A commotion in the courtyard below interrupted their philosophical discussion. Through the window they could see riders approaching at full gallop, their horses lathered with sweat that spoke of desperate speed. "More intelligence," Marcus observed grimly. And by the look of their urgency, not good news. As they prepared to receive the latest reports, Tharic found himself looking at Elyra with new understanding. The prophecy had reframed their relationship, but it hadn't changed the fundamental truth. She was here by choice, offering partnership freely given rather than service demanded. Whether their connection was destined or simply fortunate mattered less than how they chose to honor it. "Whatever we're about to learn," he said, reaching for her hand, "we face it together." Her fingers intertwined with his, warm and steady and completely present. "Together," she agreed, and in that single word lay the promise that would define everything that followed. The riders brought news that transformed their strategic situation from concerning to dire. Captain Hayes met them in the courtyard, his face growing increasingly grim as he received their reports, then hurried to the strategy room where Tharic and Elyra waited with Marcus. "The enemy force has tripled in size overnight," he announced without preamble. "Our scouts estimate 6,000 fighters now moving toward the border, with more arriving from the north and east. It's not just an invasion force, it's a coordinated conquest army." Elyra moved immediately to the large map, her trained eye calculating defensive positions and movement patterns. 6,000 changes everything. "We're not facing raiders or opportunistic invaders. This is a planned campaign with significant resources behind it." Tharic felt the familiar weight of command settle over him, but this time it felt different, shared rather than solitary. What about the force moving toward Thornwick? Still approximately 300, but they've been reinforced with specialists, trackers, scouts, individuals whose equipment suggests they're searching for specific targets rather than simply conquering territory. The implication was clear and chilling. The enemy wasn't just seeking to expand their territory, they were hunting for people with rare gifts, possibly including Elyra herself. The prophecy's warning about the darkest hour suddenly felt less metaphorical and more urgently literal. "We need to forge the Alliance banner immediately," Elyra said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar life-or-death decisions before. "If we're going to coordinate multiple forces against an enemy this large, our people need a symbol that represents unity of command." Over the next 4 hours, the castle became a center of frantic but organized preparation. Smiths worked to create the Alliance banner, a design that incorporated both the wolf crown of Valdris and the flowering thorn of Elyra's coalition. Messengers rode out to every allied territory within a day's hard travel, carrying calls for immediate military support. Supply masters calculated food, weapons, and equipment needs for an extended campaign. But the most crucial preparation took place in the strategy room, where Tharic and Elyra worked to forge something unprecedented, a true partnership between rulers who had never fought together, but whose coordination would determine the fate of both their peoples. "Your strength has always been defensive strategy," Elyra observed, studying the tactical plans they had developed. "You understand how to use terrain and fortification to multiply your forces' effectiveness. But this enemy won't give us the luxury of fighting from prepared positions. And your strength is mobility and adaptation," Tharic replied, appreciating how naturally they had fallen into complementary analysis. "You've unified different packs by understanding what each group does best and finding ways to coordinate their strengths. So we combine approaches. Use mobility to force them into defensive engagements where your strategic advantages apply, then use defensive positions to channel them towards situations where mobile tactics can be decisive." As they refined their joint strategy, Tharic found himself watching Elyra with growing admiration and something deeper. The prophecy had provided context for their connection, but working with her as an equal partner revealed qualities that no ancient prediction could have captured. Her ability to think 3 moves ahead while remaining flexible about immediate tactics, her talent for inspiring confidence in others while maintaining realistic assessment of risks, her gift for finding innovative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. "There's another element we need to address," she said, looking up from the deployment schedules they had been reviewing. "The personal aspect of this conflict. If they're specifically hunting people with gifts like mine, then my presence in the battle makes me both an asset and a target." The strategic reality was undeniable, but Tharic felt his protective instincts surge with unexpected intensity. The thought of Elyra deliberately placing herself in danger to serve their joint strategy awakened feelings he thought he had learned to control. "We can use that," he said, forcing himself to think tactically rather than emotionally. "If you're what they're searching for, we can make you the bait in a trap that destroys their entire operation." "Exactly what I was thinking, but it will require absolute trust between us and flawless coordination under conditions where mistakes will be fatal." She was right, and they both knew it. The strategy they were developing would work only if they could communicate instantly, anticipate each other's needs, and react to changing circumstances with the kind of seamless partnership that usually took years to develop. "We need to test our coordination," Tharic said, making a decision that felt both practical and profoundly personal. "Not just planning sessions, but actual combat situation practice." "Agreed. But more than that, we need to understand each other well enough that we can function as a single strategic mind, even when separated by distance or circumstances." Over the next several hours, as reports continued to arrive and their available time for preparation dwindled, they engaged in intensive coordination exercises that revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities in their partnership. Elyra's quick adaptability complemented Tharic's systematic thoroughness, while his experience with large-scale logistics supported her innovative tactical concepts. But more importantly, they discovered that working together felt not just effective, but natural, as if they were recovering a connection that had existed long before the prophecy gave it context. "There's something I need to tell you," Elyra said as they paused between planning sessions, her voice carrying a vulnerability that contrasted with her professional competence. "The reason I named my territory Thornwick wasn't just to honor the place where we met." Tharic looked up from the supply manifests he had been reviewing, noting the way she seemed to be gathering courage for whatever she was about to reveal. I chose the name because Thornwick represents something that grows beautiful and strong despite harsh conditions, something that can provide protection and shelter while still being approachable and welcoming. She met his eyes. I chose it because it reminded me of what I hoped to become, worthy of standing beside the king who chose to protect my future even when it cost him personally. The admission hit him with the force of recognition. She hadn't just grown into a remarkable leader. She had shaped herself deliberately, with their eventual reunion as a conscious goal. The decade they had spent apart hadn't been a separation, but a preparation. "Elyra," he began, but she continued before he could process the implications fully. "I know the timing is terrible, with battle approaching and lives depending on our decisions. But if we're going into combat together, you deserve to know that my return isn't just about political alliance or strategic necessity. I came back because I never stopped believing that what we shared was worth fighting for." Before he could respond, the sound of horns from the castle walls announced the arrival of allied forces responding to their calls for support. Through the window, they could see banners representing pact territories from across the region. Fighters who had traveled through the night to join their cause. "The alliance is real," Elyra said, watching the arriving forces with satisfaction. "Our people are choosing to stand together." "As are we," Tharic replied, reaching for her hand and finding it steady and warm, despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "Whatever happens in the battle to come, we face it as partners. Not because a prophecy said we should, but because we choose to." She squeezed his fingers, her touch conveying confidence and affection in equal measure. "Then let's go show our enemies what they're actually facing. Not just two separate territories, but a united front, led by people who trust each other completely." The Alliance banner now flew from the castle's highest tower, its combined symbols visible for miles in every direction. Below, the gathered forces represented the largest coordinated military response the region had seen in decades. But the true strength of their alliance lay not in numbers or symbols, but in the partnership that had grown between two people who had learned to see strength shared as strength multiplied rather than divided. As night fell, they made their final preparations, knowing that dawn would bring the battle that would test everything they had built together. Dawn broke grey and cold over the eastern borderlands, where the Alliance forces had taken position during the night. Tharic rode along the line of defenders, noting how naturally the different pact territories had integrated under the unified command structure he and Elyra had established. The Alliance banner flew proudly above their command position, its combined symbols visible across the entire battlefield. Beside him, Elyra sat her horse with the calm confidence of a leader who had faced such moments before. In her hands, she held the Unity Blade, a sword forged during the night by the combined efforts of both territories' smiths, its steel incorporating metals from both Valdris and Thornwick traditions. The weapon was more symbol than tool, representing their joint commitment to stand together regardless of the cost. Enemy scouts report the main force will reach optimal engagement range within the hour, Captain Hayes reported, riding up with the latest intelligence. They're maintaining formation discipline. But our forward observers note some confusion in their ranks. They seem surprised by the size of our coordinated response. "Good," Elyra replied, her green eyes scanning the terrain they had chosen for this confrontation. Let them wonder what else they might have underestimated. The battlefield itself represented the culmination of their joint strategic planning, a series of wooded hills that provided natural defensive positions, while offering multiple routes for mobile tactics. Their forces were deployed in carefully coordinated groups that could support each other while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Remember, Tharic addressed the assembled pack leaders who would coordinate their respective units. "We're not just fighting to defend our territories. We're proving that unity creates strength rather than weakness. Every decision you make reflects not just on your own people, but on the Alliance itself. As the enemy force came into view, Tharic felt the familiar combination of anticipation and dread that preceded major combat. But this time, the burden felt shared rather than solitary. Elyra's presence beside him provided not just tactical support, but emotional balance that allowed him to think clearly despite the magnitude of what they faced. The enemy army was indeed impressive. 6,000 fighters moving with the kind of disciplined precision that spoke of professional military leadership. But as they approached the Alliance positions, subtle signs of uncertainty began to appear in their formations. They had clearly expected to face scattered, uncoordinated resistance, not a unified force deployed with sophisticated tactical understanding. "There," Elyra said quietly, pointing to a group of riders positioned slightly behind the enemy's main force. "Those are the hunters, the specialists looking for individuals with rare gifts. See how they're equipped differently, how they stay separate from the main combat units." Tharic studied the group she indicated, noting the lighter armor, specialized weapons, and the way they seemed to be studying the Alliance forces rather than preparing for immediate combat. "They're looking for you, which gives us the advantage," she replied with a smile that mixed determination with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. "They're focused on a specific target, which makes them predictable." The first clash came at mid-morning, when the enemy's advance units encountered the Alliance's forward positions. The sound of battle echoed across the hills, the clash of steel, the calls of pack leaders coordinating their fighters, the organized chaos that defined large-scale combat. But from their command position, Tharic and Elyra could see that their tactical planning was working exactly as intended. "Eastern flank is holding," reported one of Elyra's lieutenants, riding hard from the front lines. "The enemy is trying to probe for weakness, but our coordinated response is forcing them back." "Western approach shows similar results," added one of Tharic's scouts. "They're not adapting well to facing unified resistance." As the battle developed, the true test of their partnership began to unfold. Managing a coordinated defense required constant communication, instant decision-making, and the kind of tactical flexibility that could only come from complete trust between commanders. "They're shifting focus to the center," Elyra observed, watching enemy movements through a spyglass. "Trying to break through with concentrated force where they think we're weakest, which plays directly into our trap," Tharic replied, signaling to the reserve units he had positioned behind the apparent weak point. "Let them commit to the attack, then show them what coordinated counteraction looks like." The enemy's assault on their center position was ferocious and well executed, exactly the kind of disciplined attack that might have succeeded against traditional defensive tactics. But the Alliance forces responded with something their enemies hadn't encountered: seamless coordination between different fighting styles. Combined tactics that amplified each group's strengths while compensating for their individual weaknesses. When the enemy pressed forward, expecting to break through traditional pack resistance, they instead found themselves facing layered defenses that adapted instantly to their changing approach. When they tried to exploit perceived gaps in the Alliance line, they discovered that those gaps were deliberate traps designed to channel attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. "Now," Elyra said as the enemy force became fully committed to their central assault. "Before they can recognize the trap and adapt," Tharic raised the Unity blade, its polished surface catching the morning light in a signal visible across the battlefield. Instantly, the Alliance forces executed the maneuver they had practiced through the night, a coordinated counterattack that struck the overextended enemy from multiple directions simultaneously. The effect was devastating and immediate. The enemy force, caught in the middle of their own assault, found themselves surrounded by Alliance units that fought with unprecedented coordination. Pack fighters who had trained separately for years moved together as if they had been drilling as a single unit for decades. But even as their tactical success became apparent, Tharic noticed the specialized hunters beginning to move. Rather than participating in the main battle, they were using the chaos of combat as cover to search for their specific targets, individuals whose rare gifts made them valuable prizes worth, risking an entire invasion to capture. "They're making their move," he warned Elyra, pointing toward the hunter group as they began to separate from the main enemy force. "Perfect," she replied, her hand moving to the hilt of the Unity blade with obvious anticipation. Time to give them exactly what they're looking for. What happened next would be remembered in the chronicles of both kingdoms as the moment when true partnership transcended individual capability. Elyra spurred her horse toward the approaching hunters, the Unity blade gleaming in her hand, while Tharic coordinated the continuing battle with tactical precision that seemed almost supernatural in its effectiveness. But they weren't acting as separate commanders anymore. They had become something unprecedented, a dual leadership that functioned as a single strategic mind across multiple fronts simultaneously. "Eastern reserves advance on my signal," Tharic called, his voice carrying across the battlefield, even as his attention remained focused on Elyra's deliberately exposed position. "Let them think she's isolated." The hunters took the bait exactly as they had hoped, seeing what appeared to be their primary target separated from the main alliance force. They broke formation and converged on Elyra with the focused intensity of specialists who had finally found their prize. They never saw the trap closing around them. As the hunters reached optimal engagement range, Elyra's retreat led them directly into a carefully prepared killing ground where alliance forces waited in concealment. But the masterstroke came when she suddenly turned to face her pursuers, the healing light that had once saved a king's life now blazing around her like a visible manifestation of power. The enemy's confusion was complete and fatal. They had expected to capture a valuable individual. Instead, they found themselves facing a formidable warrior whose gift enhanced rather than replaced her combat abilities, backed by coordinated support that anticipated their every move. "Now!" Tharic shouted, and the hidden alliance units struck from all sides simultaneously. The hunter elimination was swift and decisive, but its impact on the main enemy force was even more profound. Seeing their specialists destroyed and their primary objective clearly beyond reach, the enemy army's discipline began to collapse. What had been coordinated assault became desperate retreat as individual units realized they faced an enemy whose unity was unbreakable. "They're breaking," Captain Hayes reported, riding up with barely contained excitement. "The entire western flank is in full retreat, and their center is falling back in disorder." But Tharic and Elyra weren't finished. As the enemy retreat began, they initiated the final phase of their strategy, a coordinated pursuit that prevented the invasion force from regrouping while avoiding the overextension that might allow for counterattack. "Pursuit units, maintain formation discipline," Elyra commanded, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "We want them gone, not martyred. Drive them back across the borders, but don't follow them into unfamiliar territory." The pursuit was as masterfully executed as the defense had been. Alliance forces pressed the retreating enemy hard enough to ensure complete withdrawal, while maintaining the coordination that had made their victory possible. By midday, the invasion force was in full retreat. Their coordination shattered, and their objectives completely failed. As the immediate threat ended, Tharic and Elyra met at the center of the battlefield, both showing the exhaustion and elation that followed successful combat. Around them, alliance forces were securing the field, tending to wounded, and beginning the process of victory consolidation. "They won't return," Elyra said, dismounting and offering the Unity blade to Tharic in a gesture that spoke of shared triumph rather than individual glory. "Word will spread that our territories are unified, that attacking one means facing both." "More than that," Tharic replied, accepting the blade but immediately offering it back to her in recognition of their equal partnership. "They'll spread the word that some alliances create strength rather than compromise it. The enemy's surrender token, a black banner that traditionally signified complete defeat, was brought to them by Captain Hayes, whose weathered face showed the kind of satisfaction that came from witnessing tactical mastery in action. Their commander wishes to formally surrender and negotiate terms for withdrawal, he reported. He specifically requests to meet with both alliance leaders together. The formal surrender ceremony took place at sunset, with representatives from every pact territory that had contributed to the alliance victory present as witnesses. The enemy commander, a professional soldier whose competence made their defeat even more significant, acknowledged not just military defeat, but the failure of their strategic assumptions. We came expecting to face scattered opposition and profit from divided loyalties, he admitted with the honesty of someone who recognized superior strategy when he encountered it. Instead, we found unity that multiplied strength rather than dividing it. As the defeated army began its withdrawal under alliance escort, Tharic and Elyra stood together watching the sun set over territory that would remain free because of their partnership. The unity blade rested between them, no longer a weapon, but a symbol of what they had accomplished together. The prophecy spoke of alliance blooming in the darkest hour, Elyra said quietly. But I think what bloomed was something even more significant, proof that some partnerships transcend the sum of their individual parts. Tharic turned to study her face in the golden light of evening, seeing not just the remarkable woman she had become, but the partner who had helped him become a better leader than he had ever been alone. The king who sent away a 12-year-old child to protect her future, he said, never imagined that her return would save not just his kingdom, but himself, she smiled, the expression transforming her battle-weary features with warmth that spoke of deep affection earned through shared trial. And the woman who spent 10 years preparing to stand beside him as an equal never imagined how natural it would feel when the moment finally came. The alliance banner still flew proudly over their command position, its combined symbols now representing not just political cooperation, but personal partnership that had proven stronger than any individual strength. Around them, the unified forces that had achieved impossible victory were celebrating not just military success, but the birth of something new, an alliance based on equality, trust, and shared commitment to protect what they valued most. As night fell over the battlefield where their partnership had been tested and proven, both knew that their greatest victory wasn't the defeat of an enemy force, but the discovery that some connections are worth fighting for, and some partnerships are worth any sacrifice to preserve. 3 months after the great battle, Castle Valdris had been transformed from a solitary seat of power into the beating heart of an alliance that stretched across the eastern territories. The changes were visible everywhere, in the flags that flew alongside the royal standard, in the diverse faces that filled the great hall during council meetings, in the easy cooperation between guards who had once served separate territories. But the most significant transformation was in the king himself. Tharic moved through his duties with energy that had been absent for years, making decisions with the confidence of someone who no longer carried the full weight of leadership alone. The simple gold band he now wore, not a traditional crown, but a symbol of partnership freely chosen, caught the morning light as he reviewed reports with the same careful attention he had always brought to his responsibilities. The harvest reports from the eastern territories show remarkable improvement, Marcus observed, spreading the latest agricultural assessments across the council table. The coordination of resources and shared expertise have produced yields that exceed what any individual territory achieved alone. Elyra looked up from the diplomatic correspondence she had been reviewing, her green eyes bright with satisfaction. It turns out that sharing knowledge about soil, management and crop rotation works, as well as sharing military intelligence. The partnership that had saved both kingdoms in battle had proven equally effective in peacetime governance. Their joint approach to leadership, combining Tharic's systematic experience with Elyra's innovative perspective, had created administrative efficiency that benefited every citizen in the Alliance territories. The Northern Pact leaders have formally requested Inclusion in the alliance structure, Elyra continued, holding up a scroll bearing multiple seals. They've seen the prosperity that comes from coordinated effort and want to be part of something larger than individual territorial survival, which brings us to nearly 15,000 people unified under the Alliance banner, Tharic replied, feeling pride in their accomplishment, but also awareness of growing responsibility. We've created something that's becoming too important to trust to informal agreements. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young messenger bearing news that made both leaders smile. Captain Hayes entered the council chamber with a small delegation that included children from several Alliance territories, their faces bright with excitement and carefully prepared speeches. "Your Majesties," the oldest child began, using the plural title that had become natural as the Alliance evolved into something approaching joint monarchy. "We've come to present you with a gift from all the territories." What they brought forward was a living symbol of everything the Alliance had accomplished, a small thornwick plant, carefully potted and healthy, its roots intertwined in soil taken from every territory that had joined their cause. The symbolism was both obvious and profound. Growth through unity, beauty despite harsh conditions, strength that came from shared foundation rather than individual struggle. "This will be planted in the castle gardens," Tharic said formally, accepting the gift with the gravity appropriate to such moments, "where it will grow to remind future generations that some partnerships create beauty that transcends what any individual can achieve alone." But the deeper significance of the ceremony lay in what it represented about the Alliance's evolution. What had begun as a military necessity had become a social and political structure that genuinely improved people's lives. The joint leadership model they had developed was being copied by smaller territories, creating a network of cooperative governance that promised lasting peace and prosperity. After the ceremony, as evening fell over the castle and the last of the day's official business was concluded, Tharic and Elyra found themselves alone in the private garden where the thornwick plant had been given its permanent home. The space had become their favorite retreat, a place where they could speak freely about both personal and political matters without the formal constraints that public appearances required. "Do you ever wonder what the 12-year-old girl who saved a king's life would think of all this?" Tharic asked, gesturing toward the thriving Alliance territories visible beyond the garden walls. Elyra settled beside him on the stone bench they had placed near the newly planted thornwick, her shoulder brushing his in the comfortable intimacy that had developed over months of shared responsibility and mutual respect. "I think she would be amazed that her impulsive decision to help someone in need could lead to something this significant," she replied thoughtfully. "But I also think she would understand that the real magic wasn't in the healing gift itself, but in the connection that made healing possible." "And what about the woman who spent 10 years preparing to return to him? She's learned that some waiting is worth it, and some partnerships justify any amount of patience required to make them work." Elyra turned to meet his eyes, her expression carrying both contentment and anticipation. "But mostly, she's learned that the best alliances aren't based on what people can do for each other, but on what they can become together." The thornwick plant beside them was already showing signs of adaptation to its new environment, small buds appearing that promised future flowers. Like their alliance, it represented potential that would only be fully realized through time, care, and continued commitment to growth. As the stars appeared overhead, Tharic reflected on the journey that had brought them from a desperate battlefield encounter between a dying king and a determined child to this moment of shared leadership and mutual partnership. The prophecy had provided context, but their choices had given it meaning. The crisis had forced them together, but their respect for each other had made them choose to stay together. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, feeling both nervous and certain about the step he was contemplating. "The Alliance has proven itself. Our joint leadership is working better than either of us imagined, and our people have accepted us as partners in governance. But there's one partnership we haven't made official. Elyra's smile suggested she had been expecting this conversation, but her eyes showed genuine emotion as she waited for him to continue. I'm asking not because the alliance requires it, and not because political necessity demands it, but because I want to spend the rest of my life discovering what we can accomplish together. Her answer came without hesitation, carrying the same decisiveness that had characterized her approach to every important choice. I've been waiting 10 years to hear that question, and my answer hasn't changed in all that time. Yes, Tharic. Yes to partnership, yes to shared dreams, yes to growing old together while building something that will outlast both of us. The gold band that symbolized their alliance caught starlight as he took her hand, feeling the same sense of rightness that had characterized every important moment in their relationship. Around them, the castle that had once been the solitary seat of a tired king now hummed with the activity of an alliance that touched thousands of lives. But in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of what they had built together, the most important truth was simpler than grand strategy or political achievement. Sometimes the greatest victories were personal, the triumph of patience over haste, partnership over solitude, and love that had grown from shared purpose into something that would define the rest of their lives. The thornwick plant rustled softly in the evening breeze, its thorns providing protection while its leaves promised eventual flowers. Like the alliance they had created, like the partnership they had chosen, it represented the beautiful reality that some things grow stronger through challenge, more lovely through difficulty, and more valuable through the patient tending that true partnership requires. Their story had begun with a child's courage and a king's gratitude. It would continue with a woman's wisdom and a partnership that proved some waiting is not just worthwhile, but essential to creating something genuinely worth having.